having travelled the universe, conquering absolutely, melding his being with his foes, and unwittingly becoming a ploy in the machination of those older and more devious than most of the outer gods themselves. The Moon Lord now only had one hurdle between him and the path to absolute cosmic domination. There was a reason he had left until last, however, for what he must now face was what he believed to be the ultimate form of life and existence, creatures capable of continually improving themselves, and even taking control of anyone who would oppose them. Here the Moon Lord would either succeed, opening the way to all he ever desired, or he would eternally fail, becoming a stooge to something ultimately greater. Gods had begun. Humanity had all players deep and challenging, different is less likely to get me horribly Within a dense stellar nursery, a young planet encircles a star not long its senior. Here, in pools of primordial ooze, life is beginning, just as it would on countless other worlds throughout the cosmos. Like those other worlds, the symbiotic union of independent cells sparks the race of life to become ever more complex, overpower their prey and grow to become the dominant form of life. It is ironic that such kinship that spawned multicellular life would ultimately lead to an evolutionary arms race that risked everything for the sake of the one. Here though, on this hidden world, things would go differently, and the one would be forsaken for the benefit of all. Where on other worlds, symbiotic cells would inevitably begin dividing, something in that nebula forced the cells of this planet to continue their symbiosis, merging, growing exponentially complex until they reached a point other life could only ever dream of. Maybe the nebula was poison, forcing a radical adaptation, or maybe it was a blessing from the gods unseen, sent to spur life to unfathomed potential. All that is known is the results, for the nebula is now long gone, blasted into the cosmic void by the thrashing of an infant star. Even in its absence, life upon the small world continues to advance at a dizzying rate. The sentience came swiftly to all creatures here, and they soon learned the secret of symbiogenesis, without the need for celestial intervention. Rather than a standard dynamic of predator and prey, where each would continually advance in order to thwart the other, the nebula creatures sought out the most different organisms of life they could and willingly merged together, becoming a greater organism while maintaining the combined essence of the original beings. On occasions though, a merger would go awry, and a lesser primordial animal would be birthed, but in the vast majority of cases, a superior being would emerge, encompassing only the best traits of its forebears. The controlled pattern of combining genetic traits continued for thousands of generations, allowing the nebula creatures to unlock incredible abilities, including telepathy and telekinesis. In time, they found vocalized communication to be clumsy and imperfect, opting to embrace the wholesale sharing of thoughts and feelings, so there would no longer be any misunderstanding among them. This decision would ultimately allow them to more efficiently decide which beings should share their essence, and they would eventually find themselves as masters of genetic manipulation, beyond even what they had accomplished previously. The mergings become regimented and calculated. The process of evolution left no longer to anything resembling natural selection, but to a council of genetic purity. Made up of only the most advanced specimens of their kind, the council's membership would be continually swapped out with increasingly advanced but inevitably cold and more calculating individuals. For a time, the council worked to advance themselves faster than they ever had before, but the swiftness of their evolution had created a problem. In their efforts to create the most superior being possible, most of their kind had been deemed as imperfect and were left behind. Among them, their already accelerated evolution continued, but for the council, it just wasn't fast enough. And for the first time in their planet's history, a schism had formed. The few existed as hugely advanced, self-improving demigods incarnate, where the many were considered backwards and impure. A time will come, however, when the so-called impure would become saviors of their entire race. For now, the council continued their work, focusing more and more on the latent abilities of the mind, now that their physical form had reached an apex, a self-levitating mass of brain and prehensile tentacles. Their mental abilities would grow beyond comprehension, their telekinesis becoming so advanced that they could construct complex items with not but a single thought. Given time, this capability would extend to the molecular level and beyond, allowing them to disintegrate anything they chose and reconstitute the atoms into anything they wished. Their gene pool had become limited, however, and soon they would reach the pinnacle of their evolution. Continuing to combine genetic strains, all they found was an impending wall of stagnation. The council even tried to use their telekinetic finesse to alter the very DNA of future generations, but all this resulted in was barely sentient abominations that begged for death. Eventually it was decided that there was no other way. In order to continue their advancement, they must look to the inferior life they had long ago outpaced. Of course, there was no way that the council members could merge their genome with the others even if they wanted to. They had diverged too much for that. But there was still merit in examining their genetic makeup. The council hoped that they may be able to artificially advance those they deemed inferior while maintaining a larger gene pool, so that one day they may supersede them. They willingly accepted that the council would be erased, that those who had once been called lesser would become more than they could ever be. Then again, it had long ago been accepted that the council had been a failure, an evolutionary dead end, and for the good of their species, something else had to be attempted. To this end, vast laboratories and research complexes were constructed across their world, and they set to experimenting on lesser beings, some willing, but most not. For a long while there was no advancement in their efforts. Some primitive creatures had been formed as a fresh genetic template, dubbed evolution beasts. But other than that, the council had focused too much on attempting to recreate their own nature, fully aware that something brand new was required, but unable to completely accept it. Bastard attempts at recreating themselves resulted in nightmarish floating brains, all eyes and vestigial appendages. It was now that a bold idea was considered. The universe, they knew, was teeming with life, full of genetic variety, but until now they had viewed them as lesser than even the inferior beings of their own world. But now they saw them as a resource ripe for the taking. Making very slight adaptations to their own form, the council would venture to these other worlds, dominate them with their overwhelming abilities, and then use their new adaptations to partially merge with select specimens of the planets they invaded. They would have restrained their victims with their tentacles before engulfing their heads, extracting samples of their genetics to return home. Back in their research facilities, the collected samples would be studied in an attempt to find the key to their continued evolution. Little did they know that the key would eventually find them. In the meantime, they encountered ever-increasing resistance across the stars, as the collected civilizations of the cosmos learnt of the brain-sucking threat, and prepared accordingly. Soon they would suffer more losses than it would be worth, and they would be returned to square one. That was until the great Lord of the Moon arrived to collect his final prize. Unlike the other worlds he had conquered, the Moon Lord now hung back, sending forth the army of minions he had already collected, for he knew of the Nebula creatures' exploits, and he knew of their power. Across the Nebula world, 3 great pillars of rock and dirt ascended from the sky, their surfaces protected by a shimmering barrier which served as a portal for the marauding creatures to pour through from their own worlds. At first, the combined strength of the Moon Lord's army decimated the waves of lesser creatures and evolution beasts that met them, but soon those of the council arrived, and in a moment halted the army's advance. They even took the opportunity to collect genetic samples before they commanded the forces to reveal their master. Those dominated by the Moon Lord could do nothing to resist the mind control, and in no time the Elder God was captured by the Council. They found that they could not control this one, however, but it mattered not, for they could neutralize his resistance, and managed to escort him back to their world, to meet not just their forces, but his own brainwashed army that he had fought so hard to build, now reduced to nothing in a matter of moments. Standing before the Council, they had decided that the Moon Lord would be dissected for his genome, as his DNA may very well be the answer to limitless evolution, not just for the Council but for their entire planet. Ever devious as he was, however, the Moon Lord offered them something else. He reminded them of the resistance they had faced across the universe, and how, with his army, they could take whatever they desired. He even offered them his DNA willingly, citing the other creatures he had augmented as evidence of its superiority. All they would have to do was serve him. But then something happened he had never planned for they rejected his offer. They already had control of his army. They could blaze across the stars themselves, and as for his DNA, well, they could just take that. For once the Elder God knew not what to do, and tried to break free, but was subdued by his own forces and carried away to the research institutes. There were those in his army who had not been brainwashed though, and were merely playing along to see what happened. But now it was time for them to act, for the end of the Moon Lord's plans at the moment meant the end of their own plans. Using their vast cosmic abilities, the Stardust Weavers merely erased the ones controlling the solar fighters and vortex parasites, and directed them to free their master at all costs. Now utilizing their full power and protected by the Weavers, the Celestial Army decimated the Nebula telepaths and made their way to free the Moon Lord. By now they had already harvested his genome and created a bipedal prototype, the next step in the Nebula creature's evolution. And once the Moon Lord was free, he deemed that it was as near perfection as anything could be, and that it must be preserved. As for the rest of the planet though, it could not be tamed and must be eradicated. Before following through though, the Moon Lord paused. The piece of themselves the Stardust Weavers had implanted into his mind speaking to him. It convinced him that they could still be useful, and that he was so close to his destiny that he shouldn't just throw it away. If he commanded them, they would follow. And so it was. The fighting ceased, and when the Moon Lord spoke, the Nebula telepaths listened. In fact, the Elder God's words were as impotent as they ever had been. But now the Weavers had taken their own hold of the telepaths. Truly this was no longer the Moon Lord's army, but that of the ancient creatures of Stardust. As far as he was concerned though, his quest was complete. He now controlled the four most powerful armies in the universe, and although he may have to bide his time, there was nothing standing in his way to completing his final goal, the birth of a fifth, ultimate army to make him the strongest creature in all of creation. In reality, he was nothing but a stooge for the machinations of those beyond even him. He may have wanted to rule the cosmos, but they would utterly annihilate it, and there was only one who could stop any of them. But at this point, their story was only just beginning. Hi everyone, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did and want to support the channel, then please consider subscribing and hit that bell so that YouTube might possibly inform you when a new video comes out. If you want to go that bit further, please feel free to support the channel on Patreon or go and buy some merchandise on Spreadshirt and Teespring. Links are all down in the description. Other than that, have a great day and I'll see you next time.